let's look at that. Let's look at the social side of it, and that's primarily where I was going, because the green paper really looked at the economic impacts. It did mention the $4.6 million for social disbenefits. Let's look at that a little bit more. Now, in researching this, and if anybody goes on Google, you'll see there is 1,000 times 1,000 papers on gambling. And one of the things you will find, or what you should look for, is who is funding the study. Because your results are going to be different, and it shouldn't be, but they are, depending on who funds your study. If it's done by those who are pro-gaming, the results are likely to favor them, or at least the results that they publish are likely to favor them. And if it's done by the non-gaming body, the results are likely to favor them. So you have to wade through that sort of that picture. This study, done by this gentleman, by Grinnells and Mustard, these are two academics, and what I particularly liked about this study is that they studied 3,000 communities over 20 years. And from a statistical point of view, they had what you call a control group, and they have an experimental group. So the control group would be those who had no gaming in that 20 years and didn't have any. And they looked at what happened to their crime rate. Then they looked at the communities that didn't have it and then had it, and then looked at what happened to them after 20 years. So if anything happened, of course, anybody who does statistics will know we can't prove that one causes the other, but what it sure does point to is what's left. And in this case, the introduction of gambling would be left. So what did they find? They found that every area of crime increased significantly over the 20-year period for those communities that introduced gambling in their jurisdictions. Every crime, with the exception of murder. Murder did increase, however, not significantly enough to indicate that it was a result of the introduction of gambling. For example, and this paper is available online as well, and you'll get the reference in the paper if you download it. What they found was that robberies nearly doubled during that period. Nearly doubled. Now, like all papers, there are those who criticize their findings, but they all came out and addressed all the criticisms. So you can go and find the counter arguments, but it's a pretty sound study, and what you unlikely to find is too many studies of this nature which has tracked something over a 20-year period. So would anything happen overnight if Bermuda were to have gambling? No, because there are expectations that there will be some things, and there is a budget that is, at least in writing, to cover that. Whether that's adequate, whether it will be increase if the need arises, we don't know. But in the short term, there's not likely to be any major disbenefits. They tend to be long term. So after 4 or 5 years, that's when they started to kick in. Now, after this study by Grinnells and Mustard, they made what I consider to be a stark conclusion. Here's what they said. Taken all together, casinos impose crime and other costs paid for by society, including those who do not gamble, that exceed their benefits. Because casino gambling fails a cost-benefit test, policymakers should give serious considerations to options that include imposing taxes that are equal to the cost casinos impose, restricting casino expansion, or banning casino gambling altogether. This is after looking at it from 20 years. This is what their conclusion was. But there are other studies who found different things, right? Now, this study tended to collaborate with what they found. This is by Buck and others, 1991. What they found was that crime within 30 miles of Atlantic City rose by 107% in the 9 years following the introduction of casinos. Now, I've been to Atlantic City once, and that was probably 30 years ago. But what struck me even 30 years ago was driving in the outskirts of Atlantic City, all the shops and things were boarded up. That was 30 years ago. So if somebody's been there recently, they can tell me what it's like today. But I've seen something which I'll mention in a minute about where they are today. So did everybody find the same thing? No. Park and Kowalski in 2011 felt that while the impacts of gaming had been studied for some time, the impacts were not clear. Well, they found, for instance, that crime in ski counties had a significantly higher property crime rate than did gaming. Now, they're not saying there isn't crime, but they said, no, gaming is not such a bad thing. Go to the ski county and see how many break-ins you'll find. So there are some differences. And then Zimmerman, 2011, found that gambling is a relatively innocuous or harmless activity. Now, even he found in his study that there were differences by race, that blacks and lower income individuals had a much higher propensity to gamble than did whites and others. And that, in my view, has implications for Bermuda. Will that be the same here? At this point, we don't know, but we're looking at what others have found in other jurisdictions. That's the best we can do because we don't have, well, there may be some information, out there. I don't know if that sort of data is actually collected. Yeah.
Like you, I've been exploring the research on the subject, and I can perhaps help the lady who spoke over here. The Ontario Commission on Gambling has just recently published a review article with some 490 articles in it, and they come out quite clearly saying that the poorer section of our community, of the communities, end up putting more money percentage-wise into the gaming or gambling. Speaking as a psychologist and knowing a little bit about addiction, I sort of smile unpleasantly when I hear, well, we'll just create some social services to take care of the addiction. It looks as if the gambling addiction ties in closely with the alcoholism addiction, and the two feed one another. So if one is being served very inexpensive drinks while you're in a gambling setting, then you're going to be, like everything else, your ability to take care of yourself diminishes, and the gambling goes on even more and more. So we get not only just a single type of addiction of gambling, but we get an alcoholism issue. Any of you, most of us here, would know someone in your family or extended family who has had an addict, who has been addicted to something. It could be food, it could be alcohol, it could be gaming, it could be poker. I understand there's a fair amount of poker going on around the island. The last person to know is the individual who's addicted, and it usually happens after the family has deteriorated. There may already be a divorce in place. The children, the effects of an addiction on the children carry on. In our practice, we used to see families through 3 generations. So what turns out to be grandpa may have been an addict of some sort. Child has adjustment problems, and the grandchildren have adjustment problems. So the last thing we need here is to bring that type of thing into our community. And I think you've made a very nice point that it's certainly not a simple process. And the 10% that the green paper suggests, in my reading, it's been more like 50%, because as you mentioned, the long-term effects you just can't keep up. So the community is pumping money in as fast as they can, in order to take care of. And your point about Atlantic City is an excellent one. You know, I understand that it's, as you said, that it's right across from the casinos is in fact almost a ghetto-type living experience.
I think in particular I'm interested in, you mentioned some statistics about how it affects people in the lower economic situation. And what sort of statistics did you come across on that? And I know you mentioned that it tends to affect black folks more than white folks. So what else can you provide on that? Because I'm very concerned about that particular area. And also, I know that in some countries, they don't allow the local population to gamble. I think in the Bahamas, I know years ago in the Bahamas, that was the case. I'm not sure if it's still the case today. But only hotel visitors and visitors to the island could gamble. Could you also express an opinion on that?
Yeah, I didn't look, I mean, the paper only mentioned that. They didn't go into great details, but I'm sure if you were to Google that, you will find more details on that. Yes, the Bahamas, I think, had a recent referendum, which the only question was, no, there were two questions, but the one of them was whether or not locals could gamble, and that one was defeated. Locals cannot gamble. You may recall, too, when we were in South Africa in 2011, I think it was, when we were driving by the casino, and the driver said that, you know, that casino opened, and the government decided to issue no more licenses to that to the casino industry because they found that too many poor people were actually going there and gambling. And certainly, if you go to Atlantic City, being a 19 or 20-year-old student at the time, I would classify as being poor. And most of them, well, it's just a huge part of the industry, certainly in Atlantic City, that I don't know, I can't speak to Las Vegas, are people being bussed in. And you actually bust in freely, and you're given $20, at least that was what it was those days. I don't know what it is now. You're given $20 to gamble, and you know, once I lost my $20, I went out on the boardwalk, and I found that there was absolutely nothing to do. There was one little stall where you can buy ice cream or something, but there was nothing there, and it dawned upon me that that's how it was designed. That you go down there and you spend your time there, and so you're really a captive audience. And then there are now these machines that come up, these video consoles, and I think gaming in this sense is an appropriate word because they're designed after the video games. And some of those video games are very, very addictive. And there's an article that was recently in the Guardian newspaper with regards to the UK, where in one of the poorest boroughs in the United Kingdom, I can't remember which one, there was 190 million pounds that was gambled in that borough, and the council, the Labour council member, stated that that's more money than they had in the budget to run the council. And they interviewed a few people there. One of them said, you know, I've been out of work for a number of years. I've been looking. They're in one of the most depressed areas. There's no jobs. He said his option was either to stay home and watch TV or go down to the pub and use these video consoles. And they're pumping 20p's into the machine, and they get into the zone, and before they look, their money's gone. And so that's how they were able to earn 190 million pounds from a small group. So there is some evidence that it affects those in the low income bracket, because if I'm a wealthy person, I don't see my way out of my state by going down there and gambling. But if I don't have anything, could be potentially my ticket out. So you do see some evidence of that. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. Another name for statistics is lies. Okay, and all statistical studies, when you look at them, they can be spanned in a different mode. I think you illustrated that quite explicitly, that there is no hard and fast conclusion on the benefits versus the negative side of gambling. Again, depending on who you talk to. Just want to illustrate a few things. We've heard about Atlantic City in decline, we've heard of Las Vegas in decline, and of course we've heard of Bermuda in decline. I want you to emphasize that 30 years ago, Mr. Ridley talked about visiting Atlantic City. Well, I probably visited Atlantic City about 50 times, and it was the only place I was stopped by a policeman in going to a certain area. Yes, predominantly black, high robberies, but emphasize the fact that 30 years ago, Atlantic City was in a total decline. And now, barring the last 3 or 4 years when we know the world is in a economic decline, the surplus cash that the tourists used to spend, they are putting in their pocket. What Bermuda needs to make a decision on is, if I have a $2 bill or a $200 bill, which part of that goes to which entity? Okay, we've had some statistics presented. Okay, we've heard about decline, or increase in alcoholism. We've heard about additional psychological services required. Yes, those are facts. Take your tourism dollar, wherever it comes from, could be local, could be outside, decide for yourself what part do you want. Okay, so we've had, according to the numbers presented, about 3,000 jobs. Well, I worked in the casino industry for 10 years. I won't tell you what I did. Based on that, the 3,000 number is actually a much lower number. It might be the direct employment of what the casino will employ, but there are a whole set of other industries that are related to gambling and gaming. Let me ask a few questions. Okay, one is the technicians that are going to be working on and operating those things. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we have the entire sports arena. We have the entire reef arena. For most people that come to a gaming resort, they are not coming just to drop their money in a machine or on a table. They spend their money on a whole facet of other effects that has a knock-on effect on, not only am I bringing my family, I'm spending money in a hotel, I'm going fishing, I'm going entertaining, I'm doing other things. So I vote for, if I was to make a decision, and of course a referendum is the way to go, okay, and understand that when you are making your mind on the referendum issue, that think of the broader aspect of what extra tourism dollars bring, and then we decide on how that dollar is going to be split. Okay, so we could decide that, hey, 30% of this goes towards training. Okay, the youth unemployment, the youth sitting on the wall, disadvantaged youth. Okay, that happens whether you're in black communities or white communities. There are as many any affected white folks in Atlantic City as there are black folks. Again, with the premise that Atlantic City was in a decline. 30 years ago, it was a terrible place. Now, it is much better. Okay? Barring the last 3 or 4 years, okay, we have sailing. We have a whole variety of other sports that people come. If you want to attract the tourists, you want to attract their dollars, then you got to offer them something. As I see it at this moment, come the nighttime, Hamilton is dead. Okay, we need to revitalize that, and the best way to do that is to encourage responsible gaming, gambling, whatever term you want to use, but it will provide a lot of job benefits.
But during your research, did you ever research the Native American model? Because during the 80s, I went to school in Rhode Island, and of course, right down 95 was Foxwood casinos, and the Pequot Indians that built that casino. And I have to say built because their model was, it was their land, they cleared their land, they built the casino, they staffed the casino. But a critical component of that model was the casinos were owned by the tribal council. And yes, obviously they had to bring in hotel backing and management groups. But a large portion of their shareholdings or their surpluses was fed directly back to all the tribal members. And let's be honest, Bermuda has a lot of commonality. We're isolated like many of the Native American communities. We're essentially one tribe, okay, despite the differences we put between ourselves. And would that model have any value in Bermuda? And certainly when I was out there, it was well known that if you could establish that you were an adult member of that tribe, you could be actually earning $100,000 per annum as an adult. Your children's education was paid for out of scholarship, okay? So there are many, many models out there that we could consider. And I understand that even when the Native Americans came to Bermuda, it was partly to do business and partly to reconnect with their ancestral burial ground.
Yeah, specifically, I'm sure that they were included in part of those 3,000. I think that's the kind of thing that needs to be a part of the information process. What kind? Because my personal view was that had the referendum taken place, the likelihood it would have succeeded because people coming to tell me if they've been out of work for 2 years or so, or they need a job, and so it was on that basis that I was thinking that it would likely have passed. So the question then quickly turns to, well, what type of model? Now, the model that was proposed in the green paper was that it be foreign-owned. And I'm not sure exactly the rationale behind that, but that was the recommendation. It was only a recommendation. Now, if you were to have a model whereby one would be Bermudian-owned, then people have skin in the game. And I would think, and I'm just talking off the top of my head, that if you had one where people have skin in the game, it's more like owning your own home rather than renting one, that you have a climate whereby you have a stake in mitigating those negative impacts because you're talking about your own family members, So if a model like that were proposed, then yes, that's something that, more Bermudians may in fact go for. So I think in part of the dialogue, and I think that's what has been missing, is if you were to have gaming, what exactly is the model? All of the information I referred to came from the previous administration. Ayo has just mentioned what the press conference today was about, where the minister gave out some information as to what kind of gaming model there will be. So that's what we need to know, those kinds of details, which is why a referendum is critical, because the stakeholders get to say yay or nay. And when you say yay or nay, you know what you're saying yay or nay to. As it stands now, we don't know. And so if the Bermudian people say that's the type of, yes, we want it, and that's the type of model we're going for, then, I think the rest of us will have to say, okay, well, how do we make that work so that we mitigate those negative impacts, which the green paper admits are coming. But if you had more skin in the game, you may be more inclined to mitigate those negative impacts. That's my personal view anyway.